The new coronavirus has brought with it increased actions by local, state, and now federal government that are meant to stop the spread of COVID-19. Known to have originated in eastern China's Wuhan province, President Donald Trump is the most prominent American who's repeatedly used what scholars and others say is inflammatory language, such as the Kung flu or the China virus when speaking of COVID-19. And now ABC News has reported that a new FBI analysis warns of an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans as this health crisis continues. Iyko, Mount Holyoke College Associate Professor of English, shares her perspective on the matter.
Well, I thought it was really, really disturbing. And I think that maybe another question that I had was why President Trump would stoke anti-Chinese sentiment right now. And so I started to think about it, and I think that there are probably two reasons that might help us make sense of this moment and why he would use those words. So the first is I think that, President Trump's comment really is trying to imply that the Chinese are culturally inferior, and that we have this idea that the Chinese are dirty, diseased, and breed contagion. And that's really part of a larger repertoire of anti-Chinese sentiment in the US, and it's been around for over a century. So, and actually in the 19th century, that kind of language and those kinds of ideas and stereotypes were part of a white nativist ideology that justified Chinese immigrant exclusion for over half a century. So I think that this is really just a standard move from Trump's playbook, though. For him, it's always been easier to demonize the poor, migrants, and now the Chinese in order to deflect attention away from the corruption and incompetence of our elected leaders. And the second reason I think that the more international or global context is that, I think that Trump's attempt at scapegoating the Chinese is really symptomatic of the decline of U.S. global dominance and fears that China will, overtake the U.S. as a global leader.
I've also heard the president say, though, that he doesn't really view this using these phrases any different than saying Chinese food. For him, those are one and the same. Do you had that same perspective?
Well, obviously not, mainly because of what I mentioned before. This notion that the Chinese flu or that Chinese people are associated with disease and contagion are part of a way of pathologizing the Chinese that has been a part of the way in which white nativist fears have been expressed in this country for a very long time.
Have you heard other leaders use language similar to this?
No, but I've heard that people have tried to make an equivalence between calling it the Chinese flu and, say, the Spanish flu, for example. And I think that that's a misnomer because the only reason that the Spanish flu of 1918 was called that is that Spain was the first nation to actually report on the existence of the pandemic. And actually, the first known cause was actually from Kansas in the United States. So, and maybe another counterpoint is the swine flu of 2009 and 2010, from 2009 to 2010, which also originated in the U.S., but nobody called it the American swine flu, right? So I think that we have to be clear that viruses and pandemics do not really respect national borders. They're not ethnic or racial. They actually originate in animals and can pass on to anybody, regardless of race, ethnicity, or nation.
If we look at the history of the way that Asian Americans have sometimes been treated in this country, when you look at Japanese internment during World War II, how do you place this issue in sort of the larger, broader historical context?
That's a great question. I think that we really have to put it into the context of the way in which xenophobia, how this is linked actually to the sort of the border wall, the detention and detainment of small children, the sort of desire to place the blame on some sort of racial other for issues that are actually bred within the United States that are part of, our political economy. I think that these are all ways in which it's just a politics of deflection and scapegoating.
The president has sort of sent mixed messages recently. On March 23rd, he tweeted the following: "It's very important that we totally protect our Asian American community in the United States and all around the world. They're amazing people, and the spreading of the virus is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. They're working closely with us to get rid of it. We will prevail together." Do tweets like that make amends?
I don't think so at all. I mean, I think that one of the things that's important is that he did not actually say that the Chinese were not responsible. He said Asian American. And so I often think of, what do his words mean for an international Chinese student in the United States? The fact that his words did really nothing to quell the specifically rising xenophobia that impacts many Asian Americans is really still, it's still, he hasn't actually addressed that. And so I think that, he's actually, what Trump is doing, he's holding to the idea that Chinese are the vile source of contagion, but also saying that Asian Americans are so-called good people. And, you really can't have it both ways. It's sort of like saying that, Black people are criminals and that he's not racist. I mean, they just, you can't say they both don't hold together.
Do you think that the president should apologize to Chinese Americans?
I think what he should do, I think that there are a lot of things that he should do. And yes, I do think he should apologize to Chinese Americans for for spreading this kind of misinformation and stereotyping Chinese people and targeting them. At the same time, I don't think he ever would, because this is not the way that he leads. I mean, he is basically a classic kind of strongman figure who wants to deflect, or who would prefer to turn to breeding kind of nativist hate rather than actually deal with the many social and political problems that we have in the United States, right? So in that way, he's very similar to other strongmen that we're seeing that have emerged on the world stage, from Duterte to Bolsonaro to, Modi. And so these are just classic strongman playbooks. And I actually recommend that people check out Vijay Prasad's book, which is called Strongmen, and it's about this very issue. So I think that he will not do that. But I mean, there are other things I think that he could do, but which I doubt he would do, though.
What about long-term implications? Are you concerned that the use of this language, this type of rhetoric, will have long-term implications?
I think that it's interesting that he actually never mentions the name Xi Jinping. So he's clearly aware that he's aware of strategically trying to breed kind of a certain kind of xenophobia, but at the same time not going so far as to actually insult the leader, China's leader. And I think that, again, this is a lot of this rhetoric is about, the US and China's competition for global dominance. And, while I think that it's really necessary for us to call out failures in China's response to the outbreak, at the same time, we also have to recognize that China's done far more to break the global chain of viral transmission. First, by containing the virus in China, and then also by sending doctors, nurses, and supplies around the world. Recently, Chinese billionaire Jack Ma actually sent coronavirus test kits en masse to the United States, which I think represents an interesting geopolitical or symbolic geopolitical reversal, where American survival is now in this pandemic is now increasingly going to depend on China's leadership. So I think that that's an interesting. So we're seeing a sort of interesting post Cold War kind of dynamic playing out.
One last question. As you think about this issue more broadly, is there a message you'd like to send to Americans who might be fearful of Chinese Americans because of this language?
I think that people need to recognize that by scapegoating a particular ethnic group is the wrong way to think about a virus, which again, a virus does not discriminate against race, ethnicity, or nationality. A virus is just a virus. Perhaps if we wanted to look at the true sources of these kinds of pandemics, we should look at in particular the coronavirus. It has its origins in the that strain of viruses. They come from bats and they originated in the 1970s, and they are the direct result of the expansion of industrial and agricultural production, right, which has radically disrupted the habitats of many species, and that has, created the conditions for these kinds of disease outbreaks. So I think that that's what we really need to be thinking about. And I also think we need to be thinking about what are we doing to actually stop the chain of viral transmission, both in the United States, and to think about how our private healthcare, we're all dependent on a private healthcare industry that really cares more about generating profits than actually giving care to sick people. And because so many people have lost their jobs, how many of them can afford to, they either have no insurance to get tested, they don't have the money to pay for a copay, et cetera. These are the things I think we should be thinking about and be turning to and being outraged about. In the global context, the fact that the U.S. has sanctions against 50 nations, arguably promotes again the spread of the virus. Because these nations cannot actually get the life-saving support and supplies that they need to contain this pandemic. And so I think that when we think about the nations that are doing something, it's China, it's Cuba, it's the World Health Organization that's sending doctors, nurses, and supplies to places like Iran that we have sanctions against, Venezuela, and many other nations. And so perhaps we do need to look to that leadership.